Welcome to our channel, your gateway to the most spine-chilling tales and unnerving true stories. Today, we present a harrowing true story, Shadows in the Neighborhood. Get ready to be on the edge of your seat as we delve into this unsettling narrative. But be warned, comfort is the last thing you'll find here. It was a cold, crisp night as John pulled up to Matthew's house. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty street. He climbed out of his car, his breath forming little white puffs in the air, and made his way up to the door. The key turned easily in the lock, and he pushed the door open, stepping inside. The house was deathly silent, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. The curtains were drawn, casting the rooms into a dim, eerie light. John shivered, his arms wrapping around his chest as he tried to fight off the unsettling chill that seemed to have taken hold of him. He walked through the living room, noting the familiar furniture and knickknacks that had been a part of Matthew's life. It was strange, he thought, how empty it all seemed now. There was no sign of Matthew's usual clutter, no books or DVDs scattered about, no discarded clothes on the floor. The house felt cold and lifeless, as if it had been stripped of its soul. As he continued his tour of the house, he began to hear strange noises coming from upstairs. A creak here, a groan there, as if the old house were stretching and settling after its long slumber. It was unnerving, to say the least. John hesitated for a moment, debating whether or not to investigate, before finally mustering up the courage to climb the stairs. At the top of the landing, he paused, listening intently. The noises seemed to be coming from Matthew's bedroom. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and pushed the door open. The room was even colder than the rest of the house, an icy chill seeping through his bones. The bed was made, the sheets tucked tightly beneath the mattress, the pillows plumped and perfect. It was as if Matthew had just stepped out for a moment, leaving everything just as it should be. But John knew that wasn't the case. Something about the room felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. The air had a strange odor to it, like something was burning, but not quite. It was unsettling, to say the least. He turned his attention back to the rest of the room, taking in the posters on the walls, the books on the shelves, the clothes in the closet. It was then that he noticed it. A small, innocuous-looking box sitting on Matthew's desk. He walked over to it, curiosity getting the better of him, and picked it up. It was made of plain, unadorned wood, with a small, brass lock securing it shut. There was no label, no markings of any kind. He hesitated for a moment, debating whether or not to open it, before finally giving in to his curiosity. The lock clicked open easily, and he lifted the lid. Inside, he found a number of strange, arcane-looking objects, a handful of crystals, a few scrolls of parchment, and a small leather-bound book. He couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Was Matthew a wizard? A sorcerer? He had no idea. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard a creak from the hallway outside. He spun around, heart racing, certain that someone was there. But when he looked back out into the hallway, there was no one to be seen. The house was still deathly silent. He shut the box quickly, replacing it on the desk, and hurried back downstairs. Something was definitely wrong here, and he didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. As he grabbed his coat and prepared to leave, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding settle heavily in the pit of his stomach. Whatever had been going on in this house, whatever secrets Matthew had been keeping, it was clear that he had stumbled into the middle of it, and now he was left to wonder how deeply he was entangled. As the night wears on, the girl reveals herself to be more sinister than John could have imagined. She confesses to stealing a key from the house earlier, and when John tries to call Matthew, he discovers that his friend is out with friends, too inebriated to come home. The girl taunts him, reveling in their helplessness. Then, in the dead of night, the chilling knocking echoes through the house. John and his guest huddle together in fear, dialing the police as they hear footsteps creeping closer. The knocking grows louder, and soon it seems as if someone or something is trying to break down the front door. John's heart pounds in his chest as he peeks through the curtains, half expecting to see a masked intruder on the other side. Instead, he sees nothing but the darkness beyond. The girl, sensing his confusion, chuckles menacingly and says, "Maybe it's just the wind, or a cat. But I've seen stranger things happen in this house." The knocking continues unabated, and soon it seems to shift to the back door. John and the girl exchange worried glances as they listen to the faint sounds of splintering wood. They hurry to the kitchen, where they find the back door hanging off its hinges. Fear and anger surge through John as he realizes they are not safe here. He grabs a nearby kitchen knife for protection and gestures for the girl to follow him. They race upstairs to Matthew's room, barricading the door with furniture. John paces the room, his knuckles white as he grips the knife. The girl stands in the corner, watching him with a malevolent glare. "You know," she says, her voice cold and calm, "I think we should face this together." Before John can respond, she lunges at him, her hands clawing at his face. He stumbles backwards, falling over a chair, and drops the knife with a clatter. The girl advances on him, her breath hot against his neck, and whispers, "There's no one coming to save you, John. This is our home now." As terror washes over him, John realizes that the girl must be some kind of deranged cultist or serial killer. He scrambles to retrieve the knife, but before he can stand up, she's on top of him, her hands around his throat. He struggles for breath, feeling the world growing dark and distant. Just as he's about to black out, he hears a click, and then the girl's body goes limp. She slumps to the floor, a small dart protruding from her neck. Blinking in confusion, John looks up to see a figure in a black hoodie standing in the doorway. The figure removes the hood to reveal a familiar face. It's Detective Harris, who had been assigned to the case earlier that day. "You shouldn't have come here," he says, his voice stern but relieved. "You could have gotten yourself killed." As paramedics arrive to tend to John's injuries, Detective Harris tells him about the girl. Her real name is Sarah, and she was Matthew's sister. She had been living in a mental institution, but had escaped a few days ago. It seems that she had been obsessed with her brother's new friends and had been following them, planning to kill anyone who got close to him. The ordeal leaves John shaken to his core, but he's grateful to be alive. As he's loaded into the ambulance, he can't help but wonder what else Sarah might have done if Detective Harris hadn't shown up when he did. The night has been a living nightmare, but at least now it's over. Or so he thinks as he drifts off into an uneasy sleep, haunted by the memory of Sarah's twisted smile and the feeling of her cold, clawed hands on his skin. As the police officers frantically search the house, their flashlights illuminating the darkened corners and casting eerie shadows on the walls, John and his guest huddle together in the living room. The officers confer in hushed tones, clearly perplexed by the situation. After several tense minutes, one of the officers approaches John and informs him that the girl had indeed given the intruders a key to the house. John feels a wave of panic wash over him as he realizes that they are now trapped inside with the known assailants. The officers assure them that they will remain outside and keep watch throughout the night, but John and his guest decide that they cannot leave the house unprotected. They both feel a sense of responsibility towards Matthew's dog and towards ensuring the safety of the house itself. Reluctantly, the officers agree to remain outside, and the three of them settle in for the long night ahead. As the hours tick by, the silence inside the house is broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant howl of the wind outside. John and his guest exchange nervous glances, their hearts pounding in their chests as they strain to hear any signs of movement beyond the door. The tension is palpable, and the air feels thick with fear. It's not long before they begin to notice strange whispers and the flickering shadows of movement outside the windows. The intruders have circled the house, and they are now on the other side of the yard, hidden in the darkness. John and his guest exchange terrified glances, realizing that they have nowhere left to run. They take turns peering out of the windows, straining to catch a glimpse of their assailants, but the darkness seems to swallow them whole. As the night wears on, the whispers grow louder and more insistent, like a chorus of ghostly voices calling out to them from the shadows. The intruders continue to circle the house, moving ever closer, their intentions unclear. John's heart pounds wildly in his chest, and he begins to wonder if they will make it through the night alive. Desperate for a way to defend themselves, John and his guest frantically search the house for weapons. They find an old baseball bat and a rusty kitchen knife, feeling a small measure of relief at the prospect of being able to fight back. But as they arm themselves, they can't shake the feeling that it might not be enough. The intruders seem to know the house better than they do, and their numbers seem to grow with every passing moment. Time loses all meaning as the night wears on, and John finds himself slipping in and out of consciousness, his exhaustion battling against the terror that grips him. He can't help but wonder if Matthew will even recognize the house when he finally returns. Will there be anything left for him to come home to? The thought is enough to send a shiver down his spine. Finally, just as the first hints of dawn begin to streak the sky, they hear a commotion outside. The intruders appear to be arguing amongst themselves, their voices raised in anger. John and his guest exchanged nervous glances, not daring to hope that this might be the end of it. As the sun begins to rise, revealing the intruders to be nothing more than a group of drunken teenagers who had wandered onto the wrong property, relief washes over them in waves. Shakily, they unbarricade the doors and windows, allowing fresh air to flow through the house once more. The dog, sensing that the danger has passed, trots out into the yard, tail wagging excitedly. John collapses onto the couch, his heart racing and his muscles aching from the tension of the long night. His guest sits down beside him, taking his hand in reassurance. As they wait for Matthew to return, they can't help but wonder what drove the intruders to their home in the first place. But for now, at least, they are safe. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the dusty curtains, casting a warm, golden light onto the cold floorboards, John finally let out a shaky breath. The weight of the long night seemed to lift from his shoulders, but he knew the ordeal was far from over. He glanced over at his friend Matthew, who was pacing back and forth in the living room, his expression a mixture of shock, disbelief, and fear. The house had been eerily quiet since the police had arrived, and the two of them had managed to get a few hours of fitful sleep in the early morning hours. But now that the sun was up, they both knew they couldn't put off dealing with the aftermath any longer. They had to face the truth about what had happened while they were gone. John got to his feet, rubbing his tired eyes, and made his way over to the window. He pulled back the dusty curtains, revealing the bleak, overcast sky outside. The grass was wet with dew, and the trees were swaying gently in the breeze. It looked like it might rain later in the day. He turned to Matthew, who had stopped pacing and was now standing beside him. "You okay, man?" he asked softly. Matthew shook his head, his expression grim. "No, not really. But at least it's over, I guess." He took a deep breath, then continued, "So, what do we do now? Call the cops again?" "The landlord, let's start with breakfast," John suggested. "We can call someone later, once we've had something to eat." He gestured towards the kitchen, where the smell of bacon and eggs was wafting from the stove. "I already made some." Matthew nodded, forcing a weak smile. "Thanks, man. That sounds good." The two of them made their way into the kitchen, their footsteps echoing through the empty house. As they sat down at the kitchen table, the smell of food filling the air, they both tried to shake off the lingering sense of dread that had followed them since they'd returned home. They ate in silence for a while, lost in their own thoughts. Finally, John broke the silence. "You want to tell me what happened?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "I mean, between you and that girl." Matthew looked up, his expression pained. "It's not much to tell," he began. "We were together for about a year. We met at a party, hit it off right away. She was different from anyone I'd ever known. Smart, funny, beautiful. I thought she was the one." He paused, taking a sip of coffee before continuing. "But things started to change about a month ago. She became distant, moody. She started accusing me of cheating, of seeing other people. I tried to reassure her, to convince her it wasn't true, but nothing I said seemed to help." John nodded, understanding only too well the pain of a failed relationship. "And then she started acting like she was." "Like she was what?" Matthew finished, his voice tight. "Like she was crazy?" "Yeah, that's about right. At first, it was just little things. Hearing noises, seeing shadows. But then it got worse. She started following me, showing up at my work. I tried to talk to her, to make her understand that I loved her, but it was like she was possessed or something." He shook his head, looking down at the table. "I should have seen it coming, I guess. I should have known something was wrong." John reached across the table and placed a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder. "You couldn't have known, man. And it's not your fault, either. She's the one who did all this, not you." Matthew looked up, his eyes glistening with envious tears. "I know, but it's still hard. To think that I actually loved her, you know? And now I don't even know who she was or what she wanted." He took a deep breath, composing himself before continuing. "I just want to put all of this behind me, you know? Get back to normal." Normal. John couldn't help but think that things would never be the same for either of them. The memories of the past night would haunt them both for a long time to come. But he also knew that they had to face the world together and support each other as best they could. "Well," he said, forcing a smile, "at least we have each other. We'll get through this, okay?" Matthew managed a weak smile in return. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, we will." They finished their breakfast in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the sky continued to darken, and the distant rumble of thunder could be heard in the distance. It seemed as if the world was echoing the turmoil they both felt inside. But they were together, and they would find a way through the darkness together. As they cleared the table and began to wash the dishes, John glanced over at his friend and gave him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "It's going to be all right, Matthew," he said. "We'll get through this." And though the words might have sounded hollow to anyone else, John meant every one of them. Because in that moment, as they stood together in the quiet of the kitchen, he knew that they had no choice but to believe them. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows of Matthew's empty house, John awoke with a start. The weight of the previous night's events pressed down on him like an anvil, making it difficult to catch his breath. The house was still, the silence deafening in contrast to the terror that had filled it only hours before. He glanced over at Matthew, who was curled up on the couch, his face etched with exhaustion and fear. They had spent the entire night locked in the study, huddled around a flickering candle, trying to stay awake and protect each other. The intruders had tried several times to break down the door, but they had managed to hold them off until dawn. Now, as the sun rose higher in the sky, they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. John stood up slowly, his joints stiff from the cold and the tension. He stretched, wincing as his muscles protested, and then walked over to the window. The neighborhood was quiet, the only movement a lone car meandering down the street. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, they had been fighting for their lives. He turned back to Matthew, who was now slowly stirring awake. "You okay, man?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Matthew nodded, then winced as he struggled to sit up. "I'll live. Thanks for staying with me. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." He looked at John, his expression a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "You know, that girl, she wasn't my girlfriend. I've never even met her." John felt a chill run down his spine at Matthew's words. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Matthew said, rubbing his eyes, "she was just some weirdo who came out of nowhere. She knew my name, and she knew about us. About you. She must have been following me or something." The implications of what Matthew was saying settled heavily on John's shoulders. If the girl wasn't Matthew's girlfriend, then who was she? And why had she been so desperate to get into the house? The question swirled around in his head, making it difficult to focus. They decided to wait until they could talk to the police before discussing it any further. For now, they needed to make sure that everything was in order. John checked on the dog, who was sleeping peacefully in her bed, and then began to make some coffee. The smell of brewing coffee filled the kitchen, and soon Matthew joined him, rubbing his eyes and trying to wake up. As they sipped their coffee and tried to make sense of the night's events, they heard a loud knocking at the front door. John exchanged a worried glance with Matthew, but then forced himself to calm down. It must be the police, they thought. They hurried to the front door and opened it, revealing two uniformed officers standing on the porch. The lead officer introduced himself as Officer Thomas, and they explained what had happened the previous night. As they spoke, John couldn't help but notice the look of disbelief on the officer's face. He seemed to be having trouble processing the story, as if it were some bizarre fantasy. Finally, Officer Thomas thanked them for their cooperation and told them that they would investigate the matter further. As they walked away, John and Matthew exchanged another worried glance. They both knew that something was still very wrong. Over the next few days, John and Matthew tried to return to their normal lives. But the events of that night continued to haunt them. John struggled to concentrate at work, and Matthew found himself constantly checking over his shoulder, as if he were being watched. They both knew that they needed answers, and they were determined to find them. The police investigation dragged on, but it yielded little in the way of concrete results. The intruders had managed to disappear into the night without leaving any trace behind. The only lead they had was the girl, who had vanished without a trace. Despite the lack of progress from the police, John and Matthew refused to give up. They began to conduct their own investigation, poring over old photographs and searching through Matthew's personal belongings. It was during one of these searches that they found a key, hidden away in an old shoebox. The key didn't look like any they had seen in the house before. Curiosity getting the better of them, they decided to try it in Matthew's car. To their surprise, it fit the ignition perfectly. When they turned the key, the engine roared to life. But more importantly, it gave them an idea. That night, they snuck out of the house and drove to a secluded spot near the woods. They carefully removed the license plates from the car and switched them with plates from a different vehicle that they had stashed in the trunk. Then they burned the plates and dumped the remains in a nearby dumpster. With the car now effectively disappearing from Matthew's life, they hoped that it would throw the police off their trail. They decided to wait a few days before reporting the car stolen, just to be sure. In the meantime, they continued their investigation. They searched through Matthew's computer files and discovered a series of encrypted files, labeled only with a string of random characters. Using their combined knowledge of computers and encryption algorithms, they managed to crack the code and reveal the contents of the files. What they found chilled them to the bone. The files contained photographs and videos of Matthew, taken without his knowledge, as well as a detailed journal of his every move over the past few months. It was clear that someone had been following him, studying his habits and waiting for the right moment to strike. As they continued to dig deeper, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of stalking and harassment, all aimed at Matthew. It seemed that the girl who had broken into their house was just one piece of a much larger and more sinister puzzle. They decided that they needed to confront Matthew about what they had found, but they also knew that they needed to be careful. The next day, they arranged to meet Matthew at a nearby park. As they walked through the trees, they couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. Whatever was going on, it was clear that they were in danger. When they finally reached Matthew, they told him everything they had found. His face pale, he took a seat on a nearby bench and listened in silence. When they finished, he took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I had no idea," he said finally. "I mean, I've been feeling a little weird lately, but I never thought it was anything like this." He paused, looking troubled. "Do you think it's someone from work? Or maybe someone I went to school with?" John and Matthew exchanged a worried glance. They had no idea who was behind all of this, but one thing was clear. They needed to be careful. They couldn't trust anyone anymore. As they sat in the park, the weight of their knowledge pressing down on them like a leaden cloak, they knew that their lives would never be the same again. The police investigation continued, but it seemed unlikely that they would ever find the person responsible. In the end, John and Matthew decided that they would have to take matters into their own hands if they wanted to find any answers. They began to keep a low profile, changing their routines and being extra careful about who they talked to. Weeks turned into months, and still they found no sign of their stalker. But they knew that they could not let their guard down. The memory of that night in the study, huddled together in fear, was seared into their minds, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the safety of their everyday lives. As they continued to navigate this new, uncertain world, they clung to each other for support, grateful for the bond that had been forged through their shared ordeal. But they also knew that their relationship would never be the same. The trust they had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by a wary wariness that colored every interaction. And so, they lived their lives in a state of constant vigilance, always looking over their shoulders, always wondering when the next attack would come. But they were determined not to let fear rule them. They would find their stalker, they would bring them to justice, and they would finally be free, even if it meant risking everything they held dear. The sun streamed through the windows of Matthew's empty house, casting long shadows across the dusty floorboards. John and Matthew stood together in the living room, their faces pale and their hearts still racing from the previous night's terror. They had barely slept a wink, but the events of the night continued to haunt their dreams. The air in the room was thick with unease and tension. "Do you think she's really behind all this?" John asked, glancing nervously at the door. "Sarah, I mean?" Matthew shook his head. "I don't know, man. She's been acting so strange lately, but I never thought." He trailed off, his voice cracking. "We need to find out what's going on." Together, they began to search the house for clues. They started in the bedroom, looking through Sarah's belongings. Matthew's eyes widened as he found a stack of old photographs hidden under his bed. In the photos, Sarah was posing with a group of strangers in various occult rituals and ceremonies. "These can't be good," he muttered, handing them to John. As they continued their search, they discovered a hidden panel in the wall behind a bookcase. Inside, they found a secret room filled with even more evidence of Sarah's involvement in something sinister. Shelves lined the walls, adorned with ancient artifacts and forbidden texts. The air was thick with the scent of incense and fear. This is insane," John breathed, his heart racing. "What do you think she's been up to?" Matthew's face was pale with shock. "I don't know, but it's clear she's been using my name to cover up her tracks. We need to find out what she's been doing, and why she's involved with these people." They spent hours combing through the room, searching for any clue that might lead them to the truth. As they worked, they grew increasingly certain that Sarah was not just a part of some cult or secret society. She was at the center of something much larger and more dangerous. Finally, they found a hidden safe tucked away in a corner of the room. After struggling to open it, They discovered a trove of incriminating evidence, documents detailing financial transactions, plans for elaborate rituals, and even a map leading to a secret underground lair. Stunned and shaken, they called the police, who arrived to arrest Sarah and begin investigating her network of associates. As they waited for the police to arrive, John and Matthew huddled together on the couch, trying to process the enormity of what they had uncovered. "I can't believe I ever trusted her," Matthew said, his voice shaking. "She's been using me this whole time." John squeezed his friend's shoulder. "It's not your fault, man. She's a really good actress. I mean, who knows how many other people she's gotten close to like this." The police finally arrived, and Sarah was taken into custody. As they were led away in handcuffs, she shot a venomous glance at John and Matthew, her face twisted with rage and betrayal. The truth was out, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, John and Matthew testified against Sarah at her trial. They recounted their discoveries and the evidence they had uncovered, helping to put her away for a very long time. But even as they watched her be led away in shackles, they knew that their ordeal was far from over. The network of people she had been involved with was vast and influential, and there were still those who sought to continue their dark work. "We did good, you know," Matthew said to John, as they left the courthouse. "We stopped them from doing whatever it was they planned. We saved lives." John nodded, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that there was still more to be done. Something about the way Sarah had looked at them, the way she had promised them that it wasn't over, it chilled him to the bone. As they drove away from the courthouse, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sinister face still watching them, waiting for the chance to strike again. John and Matthew stare at Sarah in disbelief as she sits across from them in her cramped apartment. The air feels thick with tension and fear. They've been digging through her things, finding evidence of her involvement with the intruders and their sinister plans. Now, they demand the truth. "You were just using them?" Matthew asks, incredulous. "You had no idea what they were really after?" Sarah looks at them both in turn, her eyes darting back and forth between them. She takes a deep breath and exhales slowly. "Look," she says, "I knew they were up to no good, but I needed the money. They made it seem like it was just a small job. They said they just wanted access to the house." John leans forward, his elbows on his knees. "And what about the artifact? You knew about that too, didn't you?" Sarah looks away, her face pale. "Yes," she whispers. "They told me it was valuable. They said they'd pay me well if I helped them find it." Matthew glances at John, his brow furrowed. They both know that if Sarah is telling the truth, then the intruders must have been after something specific. Something hidden in the house. They decide to push her further, hoping she'd give up more information. "Where did they think it was hidden?" John asks, his voice steady and calm. Sarah hesitates, her lips trembling. "In the secret room," she says finally. "The one behind the bookcase in the study." John and Matthew exchange a knowing look. They remember the hidden room vividly. It was filled with strange artifacts and occult symbols. They'd found an old map hidden behind a book that seemed to show the location of the secret room. "Can you take us there?" Matthew asks, his voice firm. "We need to find this artifact and put a stop to whatever they're planning." Sarah's eyes widen in fear. "I can't," she whispers. "They'll kill me if they find out I've betrayed them." John leans forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "Sarah, we can protect you. We can make sure they don't hurt you. But we need your help. We need to know where the artifact is hidden." Sarah looks at them both, her expression torn. After a long moment of silence, she stands up and nods slowly. "All right," she says, her voice shaking. "I'll take you there." The three of them leave the apartment and make their way through the city streets. As they walk, Sarah tells them more about the intruders and their plans. They were part of a secret society dedicated to finding ancient artifacts like the one they'd found in the house. They believed that the artifact held incredible power and that they could use it to take over the world. Finally, they reach the house. John and Matthew exchange nervous glances as they follow Sarah through the front door. They make their way to the study, their hearts pounding in their chests. Sarah leads them behind the bookcase and reveals the hidden passageway leading to the secret room. The three of them descend the creaky wooden stairs, the flickering light from Sarah's phone casting eerie shadows on the walls. The secret room is just as they remembered it, filled with ancient artifacts and forbidden knowledge. But among them, they spot the object they've been searching for, a glowing, otherworldly crystal embedded in a carved obsidian pedestal. As they approach the pedestal, Sarah's eyes widen in fear. "Please," she whispers, "don't take it. They'll come after you." John turns to her, his expression hard. "We have to stop them," he says firmly. "We can't let them use this artifact for their own twisted ends." Matthew nods in agreement. "We'll find a way to destroy it," he says, his voice steady. "And we'll make sure they never hurt anyone again." They stand together, facing the pedestal and the ancient artifact within. The fate of the world hangs in the balance. As their hands close around the crystal, a blinding light fills the room, and a deafening roar echoes through the chamber. When the light fades and the sound subsides, they are left staring at an empty pedestal. The artifact has vanished, destroyed in a fiery explosion of magic and power. Sarah looks at them in disbelief, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispers. "You've saved us all." John and Matthew exchange a solemn look before turning back to Sarah. "You're not out of the woods yet," John says gently. "The intruders will be coming after us now. We need to find a way to protect you and make sure they don't find us." Together, they formulate a plan to stay one step ahead of the intruders. They know that they can't fight them alone. They'll need help from the authorities. But first, they need to find a way to expose the secret society and bring them to justice. As they leave the secret room, their journey to uncover the truth and save the world has only just begun. The trial of Sarah and the intruders dominated the news for weeks, with the public fascinated by the sordid details of their conspiracy and the ancient artifact they had been seeking. John and Matthew, still struggling to come to terms with what had happened, found themselves reliving the nightmarish events every time they took the stand. They described the fear, the isolation, and the unexplainable occurrences that had plagued them during that terrible weekend. The defense team, led by a slick and charismatic lawyer, did everything in their power to discredit John and Matthew, painting them as gullible and naive young men who had been duped by an opportunistic criminal. They attempted to spin the story as a tragic case of youthful indiscretion, arguing that Sarah was merely a troubled young woman who had been taken advantage of by her own peers. In the end, however, the prosecution's case was too strong. The judge found Sarah and the intruders guilty on all counts, sentencing them to lengthy prison terms. The artifact, which had been confiscated by the authorities during the investigation, was placed in the custody of a specialized museum for study and safekeeping. As John and Matthew left the courtroom, they felt a mixture of relief and unease. The immediate danger had passed, but they couldn't help but wonder if there were more secrets yet to be uncovered. They had been changed by the events of that weekend, their innocence shattered and their trust in others forever altered. Over the following months, they tried to return to their normal lives. John threw himself into his studies, determined to make something of himself despite the lingering shadows of his past. Matthew struggled to maintain his relationships with friends and family, feeling a sense of disconnection from the people he had once considered close. It wasn't until they received an unexpected letter from the curator of the museum that their curiosity was finally piqued again. The letter informed them that the artifact they had discovered in the hidden room had been identified as a powerful talisman, capable of granting its possessor immense power and control over the supernatural world. Intrigued and concerned, they arranged a meeting with the curator, who filled them in on the artifact's history and the dark forces that had been seeking it. The curator warned them that there were likely other such artifacts hidden throughout Maplewood, waiting to be discovered by those who were not prepared to face the consequences. As they left the museum, John and Matthew felt a new sense of purpose. They knew that they couldn't simply forget what had happened and move on with their lives. They had been given a glimpse into a hidden world, and now they felt compelled to uncover its secrets. Together, they vowed to continue their investigation, determined to uncover the truth about Maplewood's dark past and protect their friends and family from the dangers that still lurked in the shadows. Thank you so much for joining me on this cinematic journey. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Have you experienced a spine-chilling horror that left you trembling? Share your terrifying tale with us by emailing nightmarenetwork@hotmail.com, and we'd be thrilled to feature it on our platform. Until next time, happy movie watching.